Picture this. You're somewhere in Africa, maybe 100,000 years ago, maybe more. The savanna stretches out in every direction. The grass is tall, the sun is brutal, and you are, by every measurable standard, an animal. A smart one, a social one that uses tools and remembers faces and knows which berries will kill you, but still an animal. And then something happens. Maybe you took something that wasn't yours. Maybe you ran when you should have stayed. Maybe you failed in front of people whose opinion of you determined whether you ate tonight, whether you slept safely, whether you survived the next dry season. And in the aftermath of whatever it was, something shifted inside you. Not pain exactly, not fear, something stranger. A heat that moved up through your chest. A sudden, overwhelming awareness of yourself as an object, as a thing being seen, being judged, being found wanting. You wanted to disappear. You wanted to be smaller than you were. You wanted the ground to open up and take you. You felt shame. And here's the thing nobody talks about. That moment, that specific, horrible, deeply human moment, might be one of the most important things that ever happened to our species. Not because shame feels good, it doesn't. It feels absolutely terrible. But because what it represents, what it requires in order to exist at all, is something no other creature on this planet has ever managed to pull off. It requires you to see yourself from the outside, to hold in your mind simultaneously who you are and who other people think you are, and the gap between those two things, to care about that gap, to suffer because of it. That's not simple, that's not instinct. That's a level of cognitive sophistication so extraordinary that when you actually stop and think about it, it should stop you cold. Dogs don't feel shame. I know they look like they do. The flattened ears, the tucked tail, the refusal to make eye contact after they destroyed your couch. But research is pretty clear on this. What dogs display isn't shame. It's a learned response to your tone of voice and body language. They're reading you, not themselves. The self-evaluation piece, the internal reckoning with your own worth in the eyes of others, that appears to be ours alone. So where did it come from? When did the first human look inward and not just see hunger or fear or desire, but something more complicated, a self that could be judged and found lacking? And what did that moment cost them? What did it cost all of us? That's exactly what we're going to find out. Let's get something straight before we go any further, because most people spend their entire lives confusing two things that are actually completely different. Shame and guilt are not the same emotion. They feel similar on the surface. They both show up after you've done something wrong. They both feel bad, but underneath, they are doing completely opposite things inside your brain. Guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I am something bad. Guilt is about the action, shame is about the self. And that distinction, which sounds almost too subtle to matter, turns out to be one of the most consequential differences in all of human psychology. When you feel guilty, your brain is running a correction loop. Something went wrong, here's what I did, here's how I fix it. Guilt is uncomfortable, but it's functional. It points outward, toward repair, toward apology, toward doing better. Researchers who study this, people like June Price Tangney at George Mason, have spent decades documenting how guilt tends to produce constructive responses. You made a mistake, you acknowledge it, you try to make it right. Shame works differently. Shame collapses inward. Instead of fixing the behavior, it attacks the person. And when the self feels like the problem, the options your brain generates are not repair and apology. They're hiding, withdrawing, lashing out to redirect the threat. Shame doesn't make people better. More often it makes people defensive, isolated, and in extreme cases, dangerous. The research on this is remarkably consistent. So why does something so psychologically destructive exist at all? Why would evolution produce an emotion that, at its worst, makes people shut down, hide, and explode? That's the question that gets interesting fast. Here's what the evolutionary psychologists think. Shame didn't evolve to make you feel terrible about yourself in the abstract. It evolved as a social regulation mechanism in a world where being expelled from your group was a death sentence. For most of human history, the tribe wasn't optional. You needed the people around you to survive. Their opinion of you wasn't a matter of self-esteem. It was a matter of calories, protection, and whether anyone would help when things went wrong. Shame was the internal alarm system that told you, you have violated a norm. You are at risk of being seen as a bad investment by the people who control your survival. Fix this now. It was a threat detector, not for predators, for something far more terrifying to a social animal: rejection. And the truly strange part, for it to work at all, your brain had to do something almost miraculous. It had to build a model of other minds and then run your own behavior through that model in real time. That's not just intelligence. That's a specific kind of intelligence that the animal kingdom had never quite produced before. A mind that watches itself being watched. A self that can feel the weight of other eyes even when no one is actually looking. So, when did this actually start? When did the first human brain develop the wiring to feel shame? And how do we even begin to answer a question like that, given that shame leaves no fossils, no tools, no marks in the archaeological record? This is where it gets genuinely complicated and genuinely fascinating. Let's start with what we can measure. Shame, as psychologists define it, requires something called theory of mind, the ability to model what another person is thinking, to understand that other people have perspectives, beliefs, and judgments that are separate from your own, and to care about those judgments in a way that feeds back into your self-perception. Without theory of mind, shame is simply impossible. You cannot feel watched by a mind you don't believe exists. Developmental psychologists have tracked when this emerges in children with remarkable precision. Babies don't have it. Toddlers around 18 months begin showing early signs. By 3 to 4 years old, most children have a fully functional theory of mind. And right around that same window, shame appears. Not embarrassment, not fear of punishment, but genuine shame. The hiding of the face, the collapse of posture, the wish to not exist in the moment. Now, scale that back across evolutionary time. Theory of mind doesn't appear suddenly. It builds on earlier social cognitive abilities that we can actually trace in the fossil record and in comparative studies with other primates. Chimpanzees have a rudimentary version. They understand that other individuals have different knowledge than they do. They can deceive, they can manipulate. But the full recursive loop, I know that I did something wrong, and I feel diminished by what you think of me, that appears to be distinctly human. The neuroscience points to specific brain regions: the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate, the insula. These are areas involved in self-referential processing, in social pain, in the experience of being evaluated. And here's the striking part. These regions became dramatically more developed in the human lineage over the past few 100,000 years. The same period when we see the explosion of symbolic behavior, ritual burial, body decoration, evidence of complex social norms. Shame and civilization appear to have grown up together, not by coincidence. Anthropologists studying small-scale societies that have had minimal contact with industrialized culture find shame operating as a primary social technology everywhere they look. Not the same content, not the same triggers, but the same basic mechanism: the self-monitoring, the reputation tracking, the fear of being seen as someone who takes more than they give. It's universal in a way that very few human behaviors actually are, which tells you something important. Shame didn't spread through culture like a fashion or a religion. It was already there, built in, waiting. Here's where the story takes a turn that most people aren't expecting. Shame built civilization. Not metaphorically, not as a loose poetic claim. Quite literally, the infrastructure of human social life, law, religion, art, moral philosophy, the entire project of organized society runs on the engine of shame in ways so deep we've stopped noticing them. The first unwritten rules in early human groups weren't enforced by police or courts or prison systems. They were enforced by the threat of social judgment, by the knowledge that the group was watching and that being seen as someone who violated the norm carried a cost that could follow you for life. Shame was the original legal system, internalized, portable, always on. Religion formalized it. Every major religious tradition in human history has shame woven into its architecture. Not guilt, shame. The idea that you are being observed by something larger than the tribe, that your inner life is visible, that there is a standard against which you are being measured and found wanting. The confessional, the Day of Atonement, the concept of face in East Asian cultures, the elaborate purity systems of ancient societies. All of it is shame technology dressed in theological language. Art came from it too. The earliest cave paintings, the first deliberate burials, the ornaments and pigments our ancestors used to mark their bodies. All of these are acts of self-presentation, saying something about who you are to the watching eyes of others. The impulse to make something beautiful is inseparable from the impulse to be seen in a particular way, to be valued, to matter. Shame and the desire for admiration are two faces of the same coin, and between them, they generated everything we call culture. But here's where we have to be honest about the other side of this. Because the same mechanism that built cooperation and moral systems and art also became one of the most powerful tools of control ever devised. Shame can be weaponized. And it has been, systematically, throughout human history. Entire groups of people have been made to feel ashamed of their bodies, their desires, their ancestry, their language, their gods. Not because they violated any genuine social contract, but because someone with power found it useful to make them small. The same internal alarm system that protected early humans from group rejection became the lever that empires, institutions, and ideologies used to keep people in line. The same wiring that makes you care about your reputation makes you vulnerable to anyone who can credibly threaten it. Shame is not good or evil. It is extraordinarily powerful, and power, as humans have demonstrated repeatedly across every century of recorded history, is never just one thing for long. So let's bring this all the way back to you. Not the abstract you, not humanity as a concept. You, specifically. Sitting wherever you are right now, watching this video at whatever hour you chose to watch it. Because I'd be willing to bet that shame is not a distant historical phenomenon for you. I'd be willing to bet it showed up sometime in the last week, maybe the last few days, maybe today. The thing you said in a meeting that landed wrong and you replayed for hours afterward. The text you sent and immediately wished you could unsend. The moment someone looked at you in a particular way and something in your chest caved in before you even consciously registered what happened. That hot, collapsing, make me invisible feeling. That's exactly what that person on the African savannah felt. The same neural architecture, the same social alarm system, the same desperate wish to be smaller than you are, firing in a brain that is not meaningfully different from the one that first produced this experience 100,000 years ago, which is either deeply comforting or deeply unsettling, depending on how you look at it. Here's what I think is worth sitting with. Shame evolved as information, not punishment, not a character verdict, not evidence that you are broken or bad or fundamentally less than. Information. A signal that something in your behavior created distance between who you are and who the people around you need you to be. That's all it was ever supposed to do. Flag the gap, prompt the repair, keep the social fabric intact. The problem is that the system was designed for a tribe of maybe 150 people whose opinions actually determined whether you survive. It was not designed for a world where millions of strangers can weigh in on your worst moment before breakfast. It was not designed for institutions that use it deliberately to control. It was not designed for the way modern life turns the volume up on every source of social judgment simultaneously, until the signal becomes pure noise, and the noise becomes the only thing you can hear. The first human to feel shame was not weak. They were wired for connection so deeply that the threat of losing it registered as physical pain. That's not a flaw. That's the whole reason we're still here. Every act of cooperation, every moral instinct, every impulse to be someone worth knowing traces back to that same ancient wiring. The question worth asking isn't how to stop feeling shame. It's whether the shame you're carrying right now is actually signal, or whether somewhere along the way it became noise.